Liability and Insurance is a book that Jason and I have co-edited. We have been doing product recall work for a long time, and there's been no authoritative text on the subject matter, so we thought we would write one. We conceived of it as being a one-stop shop for people who manage product risks, and it covers liability issues, but importantly recall regulations in many jurisdictions, and also insurance, because insurance is a growth area for product recall.
What measures and precautions can companies take to make sure they're as prepared as possible in the event of conducting a product recall?
It's particularly important that anyone involved with manufacturing has prepared a recall plan. They've got to know the product risks that are involved. They've got to know the enforcement authorities, ideally, because it may be necessary to negotiate with those authorities about the type of corrective action. They should also know their supply chain and their customers, because it will usually be necessary to communicate with all of those parties. And they should also have a particular eye on traceability, because that means that they'll be able to identify exactly which batches of products are involved or might be involved, and that helps to concentrate on where the actual risk is, rather than unnecessarily involving safe products that have no problems. It's in the nature of a product safety issue that often there simply isn't a great deal of time. So it's important to have individuals or teams within a large organisation that are trained to deal with these crises and who have authority to make the key decisions.
Have there been any particularly interesting product recalls lately you could tell us about?
So the most high-profile food-related recall of recent times was the horse meat scandal, which broke just after Christmas. As most people will be aware, because it's been all over the media for recent weeks, there's contamination of beef with horse meat or horse DNA, and that horse meat is not regulated and contains contaminants such as phenylbutazone. So it's that can cause health issues in a sufficient dose, but in these circumstances it looks like it's relatively small doses, so unlikely to give rise to a risk to human health, but does give rise to other issues such as contractual issues and loss of profit. And it's led to the withdrawal of over 10 million burgers from the stores of various supermarkets. So it's a fairly large food recall, and it's a good example of the sorts of snowballing effects you can get with product recalls, and the fact that lots of companies who are involved in the supply chain have an exposure where they might not otherwise think that they have. It's very early to say what can be learned from the horse meat scandal, because it looks as though in some instances the contamination has been deliberate. Slaughterhouses have deliberately introduced meat to the food chain, but I suppose for the companies who are further down the supply chain, they may want to audit the suppliers so that they know exactly what it is that they're buying. That would be a good start, or improve their own testing, because it's been relatively easy for the Food Standards Agency to identify horse meat or horse DNA through testing, and perhaps the supermarkets and others in the supply chain ought to be testing more regularly.
What challenges do you think globalization poses?
It brings certain challenges to coordinating recalls, because if products, as they often are dispersed in many jurisdictions, then there's an issue over how to notify the relevant authorities in various jurisdictions, and which jurisdictions to notify first. And that's in addition to the logistical headache of coordinating a product withdrawal across many different countries and taking legal advice in many different countries.
What might be permitted in one country might not in another. What differences were you most struck by when working on this project?
Countries tend to fall into one of a very limited number of categories, in the sense that there are developing countries which can already be seen to be increasing the amount of regulation and the type of possible government intervention in these kind of cases. For more developed systems of law, for example in the EU, and also just after we started writing the book, Canada, there is an established regime that allows governments to mandate recalls and other corrective actions and take those issues out of the hands of the producers. And we can see also that in the USA, for example, they've gone a step further, and there are currently proposals, at least, to oblige producers to have a formal prevention plan and a formal response plan in relation to product safety recalls. A striking difference was in the availability of insurance for the various risks that we're talking about, and that tells us that while in North America and the EU there is a well-established market for product recall insurance and similar coverage, there's plenty of potential for that kind of coverage to develop in other parts of the world, such as South America.
There seems to have been an increase in the number of product recalls internationally. Why do you think this is?
It's mainly driven by initiatives on certain products. So an initiative on pesticides on foods might lead to an increase in the number of products which are withdrawn from the market because of the testing for pesticides, or initiatives on clothing which involve, as we saw recently, safety issues concerning drawstrings and strangulation risk items in children's clothing. That can lead to an upturn in product withdrawals for those. But generally, I would say, leaving aside initiatives, there's a greater awareness on the part of suppliers and distributors and manufacturers of their obligations to withdraw products where they're unsafe. And we've seen a lot of legislation in relatively recent times which has brought that into focus for members of the board. They have personal exposure if they don't act as they should, and perhaps they're being more diligent than they were. But also the media is such now that our awareness of product withdrawals is so much greater. You see images go viral on the internet in no time of products which are not doing what they should do or posing a safety risk. So there's a lot of factors involved in there, but the general trend is, I would say, upwards.
Whilst the product safety regulations globally differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it remains important, we think, that as part of any preparedness plan, that producers are familiar with the applicable regulations, and in addition the product liability risks that they face in those different jurisdictions. We think that this international guide is a handy reference point for producers involved in any of those aspects, and will point them in the right direction, at least in relation to product risks and insurance.
Yeah, it certainly draws together a lot of strands. It will tell you what your obligations are to recall a defective product, what your liability exposure is if the product has caused injury or damage, and what your insurance options are, so that hopefully in the unlikely event that you're caught out, you can be covered.